Thank you.
Okay.
On est prêt?
D'accord.
Are we rolling?
I love to go to the movies, but it never occurred to me that I could ever make movies. In fact, I went to undergraduate school in engineering, which I hated from day one.
I mean, it just sort of happened.
Before making films, I worked as a professional chef, and I did that for about 10 years.
À 25 ans, j'ai d'abord fait peut-être 2 ou 3 fois le tour du monde avec une caméra.
When I was 14, I knew I would make films. I started to develop stories and screenplays and was always chased out of offices of producers.
As a 16-year-old, it seemed to me that it would be a waste of time to be a writer. The majority of the population wouldn't be able to read what I wrote. And I loved going to films even then. I thought films was really my medium.
So I became an editor at first because it was that darkness I liked.
Starting out life as a psychologist, in science you learn to be open-minded. Very important in making a documentary.
J'ai vu Chronique d'un été. Quand j'ai vu Chronique d'un été, je me suis dit, c'est ça que je veux faire.
My first job on a documentary shoot was, here's the Nagra, you're recording sound, and I was like, oh my God.
Working with that amazing dance with people in the frame.
You'd go to lunch and you would talk about it. There was just this great kind of immersion in the adventure of it, which I found incredibly appealing.
It was astounding. And I just fell in love.
And then I went to film school. And I dropped out of film school, but that's another story.
Documentary filmmaking and ce qu'on appelle film d'auteur, cinéma d'auteur, author's film, is the absolutely the freest way of cinema. You have such an enormous spectrum of possibilities of expression.
But I'm sorry, I speak English, but it's not very well.
In the middle of the night, with a tiny camera in my right hand, with a tiny candle in my left hand, lighting the person's face, and that was, becomes cinema. That it goes on screens around the world, and it's like you cannot have less,
Documentary filmmaking is about being inspired by the moment. It's about the joy of letting something affect you and respond. Whether it's with your camera or whether yourself as a person, if you're the interviewer, it's about relating in a space like dancing.
Real life is so much more interesting and so much more bizarre than anything you can make up. And, the imagination is always limited, but somehow reality is infinitely bizarre and weird and compelling. And it's the thing that fiction films, no matter how good they are, just can't offer.
It's a very sort of super real thing that you're doing. It's highly charged. It forces people to examine themselves. It's very intense.
Donc c'est une forme d'art qui implique à la fois une manière de regarder le monde, une manière de le mettre en forme.
I think of it as a filmmaker as a way to understand conflicts and human contradictions and power. You have people who are confronted with decisions, and what are they going to do?
Pour moi, un documentaire, c'est d'abord une histoire, des personnages, quelque chose qui se raconte devant soi, et non pas une construction qui est faite a posteriori.
The part that I like about documentary is that it can be anything. The part I don't like about it is that you are constantly being told that documentary has to be one thing rather than a whole multiple of possible things.
Gus Rose walked in. He had a confession there he wanted me to sign, said that I would sign it. He didn't give a damn what I said.
We all know that you can create things that are about the world. They're not meant as purely fiction. They're meant as stories about real events, real people. We piece together reality, each one of us, from bits and pieces of stuff. Reality isn't handed to us whole.
It has the power to plant questions in people's minds. It has the power to make you empathize with things which you never really knew you could empathize with.
ये जो यहाँ पे जो बात की थी आयशा ने ख्वाहिशात के बारे में, आरज़ुओं के बारे में, तो हमें किस टाइप की ये कौन सी ख्वाहिशात और आरज़ुएं हैं जो हमें करनी चाहिए?
Rather than telling people what to think or, you know, they're learning a lesson, we're taking them through an emotional experience which opens a little window into something.
It's an emotional medium. It's not a medium of intellect and intellectual discourse. It's about engagement and emotion.
The form itself is no longer a kind of linear, information-based form. It's something which can take from other art forms, from the great river of cinema. I see them all like a painter would see them as kind of colors on a palette as you're making a painting. And the painting is in our world now, a documentary film.
Les gens à Jacksonville, en Floride, les juges, les avocats, les policiers m'ont dit plusieurs fois « Mais pourquoi vous intéressez à cette histoire? Ça n'a aucun intérêt. Aucun intérêt. Des histoires comme ça, il y en a tous les jours. » Le vrai défi d'un cinéaste, c'est de prendre une histoire qui semble être banale, mais de la raconter d'une telle manière que tout d'un coup, elle va devenir plus banale, elle va devenir exemplaire. Je n'imaginais absolument pas une seconde que j'allais faire un film sur un adolescent accusé d'un meurtre. Mais nos regards sont croisés, peut-être une demi-seconde, quelque chose comme ça. Mais ça suffit pour que je sente que ce gamin, il était complètement terrifié à l'intérieur. Et il y avait quelque chose qui ne collait pas du tout. À la fin de l'audience, je me suis tourné vers mon producteur. Je lui ai dit, mais il faut laisser tomber le reste. C'est ça qu'il faut filmer. C'est cette histoire-là qu'il faut filmer.
There's so many ideas for documentaries out there. You know, you'll go to a party or be talking to a friend, oh, you know, it'd make a great film. They're just ideas just floating out there in the ether. But the ones that stick are, again, these ones that you, where you have a lot of curiosity. I think for me, that's the biggest thing is there enough personal curiosity about that subject, about what happens in that story to propel the very long, enervating process that is making a film?
Mon premier moment, moi, c'est toujours, c'est comme un coup de foudre, hein, c'est love at first sight, hein, comme on dit. Et puis après, il y a quand même un petit temps d'hésitation, de discussion.
The eureka moment for me when I'm thinking about a film is when I really feel there's something I want to say, and I feel arrogant. I mean, it sounds to me arrogant to say that. Like, why would, you know, I have anything to say that people haven't already thought of? But in fact, that is the little egotism of the artist.
I feel very intrigued by the enigma of human beings, you know. How somebody really nice and very sympathetic can just sit there and say, yeah, my job is flying bombs into the Congo, you know. The origin of the idea was that moment 10 years ago when I met some of these Russian pilots. And I knew I had something in my hands that was very explosive and was very clear. And I knew I had found the right location and the right environment to make a point on the state of our time, you know, economically and socially. One strange product, which is that fish, tells us the whole story of our times in a way, you know?
I mean, I always tell people, if you can walk away, walk away. It's only when you can't walk away from a subject that you should make it, because it's too hard to make documentaries. It requires enormous commitment, time. You will never be rewarded financially enough. So the need to make it is actually, I think, the first essential point.
I stumble across things that immediately fascinate me deeply, and then I know there is no choice. All the projects I've done were uninvited guests, like having inviting 2 guests for dinner, and you open the door a little bit and all of a sudden you have the entire apartment, the house full of uninvited guests.
I'm giving this talk in Chicago, and this man mentions Henry Darger and that he knows Darger's last landlady. And then the next thing I know, I'm standing in Darger's room, the room that really was the place where he spent the last 40 years. And I wasn't thinking I wanted to make a film. I just wanted to see more of the work. But when I stood in that room, I had one of those moments where my heart was just beating really fast, and I was just thinking, like, the presence of this person was so strong, and this room was so beautiful. Like, everything in there was sort of old and dusty, but everything was something he had collected there. And there was just this sense of the person and the place that I felt like you could make a film out of this, and I wanted to know more. And that was the beginning of the ball rolling, the curiosity building, and the sense that I needed to try to follow this and see where it went.
There's a lot of serendipity in this world. I mean, certain projects you stalk and you try to make them. Others just come and land in your lap.
I was driving my car and I hear the news, the shooting in Oka. There was a barricade of police officers and you couldn't, it was a maze, and I guess I felt it's my duty, it has to be documented by one of us. I wanted to transmit what I felt and what I saw there and what the story was and what it was like, so that whoever's looking at it can understand what that story is, because it was so complicated. We thought it'll last, 2-3 days or another weekend, but it lasted 78 days.
Sometimes you just end up in these incredible situations which you probably in the light of day would choose maybe not to get into, but by that time you're so intrigued that you continue on.
I trotted off quite innocently to Cornwall, innocently in as much as I was looking around in the area of hunting, but not to actually do a hunt. I wanted to get into something quite remote, but I wasn't quite sure what.
Bring out, Joan. We wash it up then. All right.
This old man who worked for the hunt went out and about in his van picking up animals. And the first place we went to, he just shot it.
This is a Jersey cross, so there's no picture in it. So,
A, that shocked me, but B, then to discover the animal was completely healthy, and this was just about market values. That got me going. And then you're on it. Then you know there is something happening that you need to follow, and it starts to dictate your journey.
We only get rid of that sort, so they said we're Jersey.
What's the dramatic premise? Who is it about?
What's the underlying story?
There's something that's really important that's on the line.
You have to have some kind of framework, what you're planning to do.
You have to keep adjusting to what is going on.
And I was totally unprepared. I had no shooting permit, I had no crew, I had nothing.
Okay, get the camera out quick, shoot.
But a lot of it is just luck.
yo doy mucha importancia al guión, aunque el guión en el cine documental, mucha gente dice que no existe, pero sí se escribe y se piensa antes de filmar. Y yo le doy mucha importancia al dispositivo, que es la idea y las ruedas para que esa idea camine.
For me, it's more about the ideas and the structure at an early stage, because I always feel if I have a shape or a story or a movement through a film, then other things will follow.
About a year ago, I found out that I might have 1 or even 200 half-brothers and sisters. I don't know who they are, nor do I know the man from whose body we were all made.
I was looking for a dramatic setup, a dramatic question which would drive the quest. The basic dramatic question is, will this guy find his biodad? The underlying question is, what is the meaning of family? And I knew I had a couple of leads on who the sperm donor might be. So I knew I had that.
8 possible sperm donors, all negative.
So I knew that those leads would take me somewhere. So I figured I had enough of a quest with some ups and downs, and that's what I structured beforehand. But I was very nervous because, I mean, what if nothing happened?
Can you get the name of the donor or identify
you can't.
information? You can't.
No, you can't, no. No, we do have it, but we're not allowed to because it's confidential, and the donors only donate under that basis, that it will remain confidential.
All right, well, thank you very much for the information.
Okay, then.
C'est pour ça que des fois, je compare beaucoup le cinéma documentaire que je fais à un morceau de jazz un peu. C'est-à-dire que tu as un thème, et puis, tu te permets de t'en éloigner, puis, tu reviens avec le thème. Mais c'est ça c'est d'accepter tout le long du processus que tu puisses jouer, que c'est pas rigide, que tu suis pas un scénario là à la lettre, et puis voilà.
Disons, moi, je prépare beaucoup, j'imagine beaucoup avant de tourner. Je vais même jusqu'à dire, ce qui est quand même le comble pour un documentariste, que mes films, je veux les imaginer dans ma tête avant qu'ils existent pour de vrai.
In the Realms of the Unreal was the most pre-scripted film that I'd worked on up to that point. The paintings were one component of a world that Henry Darger was creating. He had written, the 15,000-page novel. He was writing, these battle songs to be, played in his head, and he was really creating as three-dimensional a world as he could to, sort of populate this sort of ultimate story. The structure was the thing that I worked hardest on, how to tell the parallel stories. The stories of what Henry Darger's real life, what happened factually in that time, what was happening in the world around him, and then what was the story that he was telling in his fiction, in the book, in the Realms of the Unreal. So to find a way to weave those things together was a real challenge.
I always think making a film is a bit like kind of building blocks. You start off with one thing, and then that gives you a certain amount of information. You move on to the next thing, and then so a film becomes more and more, you get more and more information as you make a film, and you have more and more questions, and your questions become more and more focused.
Before you start a film, you don't just go and cast a net everywhere. I mean, you have to say, this is what I'm interested in. Yeah. My Country looks at an Iraqi family and what happens to them during the occupation, but it's really, I think, a film about America. You're sort of on this journey, but you don't know necessarily where it's going. There is this sort of delicate balance of having a plan and then also surrendering to what you encounter. And the next challenge is identifying the people who you'll follow, who will take you through this conflict.
In a way, you're casting. When you go out and you meet people, you're assessing the level of interest you think that they will have for the audience. How engaging are they? How articulate are they? What are their particular interests and quirks? What is it about them that makes them fascinating to you?
When I think of Kathleen, what I remember, unfortunately, is her dying in my arms. That's always the overwhelming image.
le premier entretien avec Michael Peterson, je me suis dit, voilà un personnage vraiment romanesque. C'est-à-dire que on ne peut pas être certain que ce qu'il dit est 100% vrai.
And yet within, 30 minutes of that son of a bitch coming in here, it was a crime scene and I was guilty and that was it.
Et moi, ça me faisait penser vraiment à un personnage shakespearien, quoi, qui déborde. Bigger than life, comme on dit. Et je me suis dit, avec lui, on peut avoir des vraies surprises. C'est-à-dire qu'on va... Je ne sais pas ce qui va se passer, mais je suis certain qu'il va se passer des choses que l'on n'attend pas.
No, I'm not ready and I've no makeup on. But things are getting better.
There we are outside the house with Edie and this decaying old mansion with a mother inside. It's important that you choose someone that you can connect with. And hopefully things will happen that were not predicted specifically before you got into it, but things would take a turn toward a story.
Pressing, and when it sets in here, because I don't like the country and I don't want to be here. Any little rat's nest in New York, any little mouse hole, any little rat hole, even on 10th Avenue, I would like better.
I primarily make character films. I hide my issues in character and stories. But I've got to find the characters, I've got to cast it to know who to hang it on.
Doomsday, they tell me. They tell me doomsday's, we're all going to die. Hello.
The reason they wanted to be filmed is that their station was literally being allowed to be run into the ground. When people feel they're being flushed down the loo, basically, I think if someone comes in and says, can I want to shine light upon you, then people respond. There's a reason.
Close at midnight, love. Take your time.
But I didn't know the characters. I certainly didn't know Derek in the ticket shop, and he wouldn't let me in the ticket shop because I didn't have the correct paperwork. God, he was pedantic. Which is why it was so magical when I got in there, that he was as he was.
And be prepared to accept that you're not going to go any further. I think that's the difference between being happy and miserable. Because I'm not going to achieve anything in life. So, as you say, I must be depressed, mustn't I?
People want to talk to cameras mostly, not because they want to be famous. It's because there is such a seductivity of just a neutral listener. And usually we've been trained to be listeners when we have a camera. And that is a rare thing in our world, somebody to just listen to you.
People will say things in front of a camera that they wouldn't even say to their loved ones. That's what I find is so strange. The camera has this effect on you where somehow, because of the artificiality of the situation, you're more honest and more truthful rather than less honest and truthful. And I don't know quite why that is.
He would have been up at first light, I thought, because I was desperately thirsty. And he would have been, and he would have wanted to get down and get water. And he would have wanted to find me.
Now, I did stop and pause, and I shouted across into the crevasse.
As I was interviewing Joan and Simon, they would first of all come out with this very pat, very simplistic version of things. And if for a couple of hours we just got that out of the way, and then they kind of ran out of things to say. And then this extraordinary thing happens where actually the camera starts to act as a kind of catalyst and starts to sort of almost sort of drag things out of people.
And I suppose again, with the benefit of hindsight, after I got off the rope, I should have gone and looked into the crevasse to see where he was, But
and you could literally see them reliving elements of it.
Occurred to me at that time.
Once I started to see that on the monitor, I thought, well, that's the film.
I think the interesting thing is to know what is the relationship between the person behind the camera and the person in front of the camera, because that's something an audience have the right to know. It's like, do these people like each other? Do they have an intimate relationship? Is it a relationship of trust? Well, what does a filmmaker actually really think? There's this sort of weird intensity in the relationship that develops. And which developed with Eileen Wuornos in particular.
We have evil in us, all of us do. And my evil would just happen to come out because of the circumstances of what I was doing. Hitchhiking, hooking, on the road. I was a homeless person all my life.
The Eileen film was probably the most difficult thing I've ever done, and I imagine Nick feels the same way. You know, we had a relationship with her. She actually requested that we come and be witnesses to the execution, which we declined.
I choose people that I can relate to, and I trust also from my side. And before switching on a camera, I usually tell them as good as I can who I am and what I'm doing and what I'm made of, you know? Elizabeth was a key character, was a very close friend of us. Insider in a way, she knew what we were looking for, she knew our thoughts, she knew, you know, what we're about to do, what kind of film.
Tanzania, Tanzania, nakupenda kwa moyo wote.
And suddenly she's not there anymore, she's dead. And of course it had to be a part of the film because it was so hard on ourselves. And of course it's a very, very painful part of the film because the pain we had as filmmakers is now on screen. And that is what we call art of cinema, is to transform a life experience into cinema and make it into your life experience as a spectator.
Yo perdí todo. A mí me quemaron mi casa. 5 incendios. Me intentaron secuestrar mis nietos. Los hombres todos los sacaron para afuera, lo que pudieron, mis hijos.
Entonces, cuando tú concentras todo en la persona, todo, absolutamente todo, cuando tú compartes las lágrimas con esa persona, porque lo que estás recibiendo es una historia increíble, entonces la entrevista funciona.
Hay que estar. Este es mi santo.
Una entrevista es un intercambio de vida fundamental, es un espacio cinematográfico.
Está 8 días antes de irse, 8 días antes de irse. Pero no encontraron ni justicia, ni no encontraba a él.
Y así se adquiere, las entrevistas adquieren un carácter universal, son planos verdaderos, son planos.
La gente cuando siente que tú eres realmente curiosa, se abren. Por eso les llamo conversaciones, porque es como en un café, cuando estás hablando, o te encuentras con alguien en un parque, y tienes realmente una conversación.
Un señor taxista que me acaba de traer aquí al hotel me dijo señalando su carro, este está en las últimas.
Está en las últimas, pero me despreocupo de que se lo puedan robar. Este carro es inrobable, ¿no? Si no, mira por acá. El ladrón que viene acá, viene principalmente a abrir esta puerta. Cuando abre la puerta, se va a dar con la sorpresa que se le cae. Y se va a asustar de repente y se va. En caso que no se asuste, entra. Y adentro, para arrancar el carro, yo tengo que juntar 3 alambres.
You know, people think they're going to be interviewed sitting behind a desk with a flag and a flower behind them. And, you know, they become very presentational. And I think what Nick does is fantastic because he gets people in their essence. That's why he likes to be rolling when we knock on a door and somebody opens it.
Our brains are saturated with information within the first second of seeing somebody. And you see this sort of giant it's very funny. I think it's quite revealing of both me and him. We take in information so quickly, and the audience is getting all this information too. I think there's been a tradition in the past of going in and interviewing people and changing their sitting room all around and relighting it, and all you're doing is destroying the very things that you should be filming.
My dad used to tell me when I was a young kid, I'd look at a job that had to be done, and he'd say to me, you know, nothing's impossible. You know, and that always stuck in my craw. I couldn't believe it. You know, nothing's impossible.
There was no such office. We created the office. He had the insurance trophies up in the attic in a box. We brought them down. We put them up on the wall. We created this environment for him.
And I'd specifically designed my office so that I could display the maximum trophies on walls and stuff.
And in that environment,
And I'd bring this guy.
he came alive. It was a return to these heroic insurance salesman moments of the past. He came alive for the camera. We created something which was part of his fantasy world.
I don't like this whole idea of interview, you know, in a documentary, because it's like somebody's telling you something that's happened, and you sort of set something, you know. Whereas what I love is when things happen naturally in real life. It's this whole thing of seeing something unfold in front of you. Fawzia, the little 9-year-old who was 8 when she was circumcised, she came up to me and she said, "Come to my house." I thought, oh, she's going to read me a poem, and then she expects an interview. I said, "We don't really do interviews, Fawzia." And she said, "You've got to come. I've been, you know, I've depended on, I've got a reason for you to come. I want you to come." So we went in. "Stand there, Kim." Right. And then she told me the poem right into the camera.
I want to tell you a poem entitled "The Day I Will Never Forget." It was on a Sunday night when my mom called me, and she said, "My daughter, come," in a low voice. I went quietly. Suddenly, my mom said, "My daughter, tomorrow is your D-Day."
Those are the things that you sort of depend on happening, but I couldn't have planned it.
The question of how you frame an interview, how you photograph an interview, how you cut an interview is all really up for grabs and very, very interesting.
What is at the heart of this? This is the only job you've ever had.
It's a more complex phenomenon than you might think.
I'm learning about things. I am really fascinated.
I was thinking about the Interrotron before I even became a filmmaker. I certainly was aware of this whole issue of eye contact.
That's good. If you come in and you're totally clinical.
How could I get the person I was interviewing to look at me and look right into the lens at the same time? And the answer is mirrors. Prompters cross-connected, 2 cameras. My image is floating on the lens, but the camera is looking straight through that image at the person. It makes The Fog of War a different kind of film. You're really scrutinizing McNamara, and McNamara is talking directly to you in the audience.
He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals.
I don't even think it was clear to me at the time that I was making it how powerful that actually could be.
With a documentary, there's an agreement with the audience that you are referencing or giving an account of evidence-based reality, that you are actually saying, this is the way the world is as I see it. And that has very little to do with whether you use actors or recreations or anything, really, except that there's an agreement that this is an account of reality. People have a sense when that is violated. I just discovered that Werner Herzog, when he did Little Dieter Needs to Fly, he had this scene where Dieter comes home to his house in California and he opens and closes the door several times. Because he was a prisoner in Laos, he can't feel shut in. So he opens and closes the door quickly to make sure it's unlocked. And it's a very powerful moment. and I always remember it in the film. Total bullshit. Herzog made that up and made him do it. And it is a wonderful dramatization of the guy's theme, but I think that's a lie.
Look at Michael Moore. He makes pamphlets, basically. He makes polemical films where he carefully constructs a reality to serve his needs. And he's blatant about it, and he's careful in checking his facts. But when you see his film, which are hugely popular and have done a great deal for us documentarians, but he commits, some people would say, crimes towards the art form of documentary.
It is all manipulation. I mean, let's not be too sort of saintly about this. I think filmmaking and documentary making is a very subjective process. And anybody who tries to present themselves as telling the truth in some way is perpetrating a fraud, because it's just impossible.
This idea that there is no such thing as absolute truth, that truth is subjective, there's truth for you, there's truth for me, everybody has their own truth. For me, that's nonsense talk. There's a real world. We inhabit that real world. Things happen. Someone sits in the driver's seat of that car and pulls the trigger. That's not up for grabs. There's not this guy's truth and that guy's truth. There's the truth of what actually happened that night.
When you see a film and you have good reason to think that it's the truth, then your knowledge of the real world has been increased. And it's so important for us to really know what's going on.
You do have to be respectful of the facts. Yeah, you should let the facts get in the way of a good story. You absolutely should. And out of that will emerge a true story.
I tell the story in a way where I'm searching for, not for just the facts, I'm into something which gives you deeper insight, into an essence, into a concentration of something that is way beyond facts, and that is truth, as an ecstasy of truth, as I sometimes call it. Otherwise, facts are not that interesting. If you want to have facts, go and buy yourself the phone directory of Manhattan. You've got 8 million entries, and they're all correct, they're all facts, but they do not constitute anything.
All of it is artificial. They're all different shades of the same colour. What I'm trying to do in my films is equally dishonest, if you like. I'm trying to say, this really is real. This is me, hand-holding, they're talking to me, there are no other gizmos, this is life as it happens. But obviously, that's also rubbish, because I've chosen that person. The person's changing their behaviour because I'm there. In the edit, they'll be put in a context that makes them slightly different.
I mean, we're all aware that there is no such thing as an objective voice. So you must acknowledge perspective, but at the same time, I really think that unless you are constantly checking and calibrating that perspective as you're working, you can stray off into dangerous places, ethically, morally.
The sequence in One Day in September where we see Joseph Romano's body, him in a photograph, dead, covered in blood, presents classic filmmakers' moral dilemma. Joseph Romano's wife and his daughter saw the way that we put this together, and they were appalled. They said initially, we don't want that sequence to be in the film. As a storyteller, you want to impact your audience and show them how terrible this event was. I said, if you want people to feel like somebody is really to blame, you need to show them what they're to blame for. So, in the end, they agreed that the footage should stay in. Ultimately, you've got to look into yourself and say, do I feel like I'm doing something exploitative or don't I? And it has to be a personal decision, and there is no hard and fast rule.
I always tell the individual person, because it always happens. We get very intimate, and the person is in confidence, and will say things sometime that they never said before to anyone else because of the relationship you develop with your subject. And I always say to them at first, if should it be that you say something that you feel very sorry that you said it, you tell me, and I don't have to use that. Now, the difference is, I know many people, they say, you're crazy to do this, because what if the person tells you something and, you're the only one that knows it, and it's very important to the film. For me, it's never important enough for me to damage someone's life.
We think it's a kind of noble enterprise. We're revealing and capturing people's stories and transforming them and sharing them with people. But in fact, we rely very much on people's stories, so we are sucking in a certain way the stories right out of people.
It's a difficult job sometimes. There's a conflict. Sometimes you want something in the film and they don't want to be in the film. And there's a bit of a feeling of grab it and run, there's a temptation to want to do that.
I really have a problem with the sort of documentary tradition of sort of the first world going to the third world and bringing those pictures back. I mean, I think that it doesn't, I think it's problematic because it really doesn't address the fact that who's actually looking at these films.
This type of punishment, they can't bear it because they are children.
We have looked through every one of these files. These juveniles are dangerous.
It would be very easy for me to have made a film about sort of my imperiled experience in Iraq. So if I had a bunch of Americans watching a film about me in Iraq, then it would basically be a story about how dangerous Iraqis are. And ultimately the film is how much Iraqis are suffering in this war, how much like us they are, and how little we know about them.
What people often say is, people from a country should film people in that country. And there's a big truth in that, particularly for countries that have always been filmed by people from outside because of economics. But within that country, there's so many different layers. Often people with the equipment are going to be people from the upper part of society. And I remember with the court case at the end in the Down, I forget, there was a local TV crew, these two Kenyan guys there. We said to them, are you going to come back in 2 weeks, when we get the verdict? They said, oh, no, it's not a big story and it wasn't very interesting, we're not going to come back. And that's what I say to people when they say, how dare you, Kim, go to Kenya and make a film?
Those orders that were given are now confirmed. And the orders were to the effect that the girls should not be circumcised. The people who had been sued should be restrained.
That court case would never have been filmed because it wasn't thought of as important. It was never going to be filmed by local TV crews because they were interested in filming the dignitaries, the rich people. They were interested in filming what they thought of as TV events. And these little girls from the mountains taking their parents to court wasn't seen as a news story.
For me, one of the most important aspects of this ethical enterprise called documentary is to really protect the subjects that we're filming. They're living in parts of the world that are less privileged than ours, and literally their lives are on the line.
Og kampod, taktika pod kay kung critical ang kahimtang, pwede kong itabon dayon og hinahalata kay gamay kaayo.
Je suis exposé comme tout Algérien. Actuellement, il y a des assassinats qui se font partout, à travers l'Algérie.
Moi, je prenais des risques, mais les gens qui parlaient prenaient encore plus de risques que moi. Et ça, c'était évidemment le film, le fait même d'apparaître. Il n'y a qu'une femme, justement, qui avait refusé d'apparaître, et j'avais donc filmé, elle avait accepté quand même que je filme ses bras, justement, qu'elle laissait dénudés.
Et actuellement, vous pensez que vous ne pouvez pas parler devant la caméra?
Merci beaucoup. J'ai pas du tout envie de mourir. Je peux mourir de...
और पुलिस वाले अंदर घुस गए और चला गया हमारी बेटियों को मारे
In the first week of my filming, I was arrested twice. I was chased by mobs once or twice. And I knew that this was being done on orders from, ministers in the government at that point and so on. So if anything, it got my back up and I said, I'm actually more determined to finish the film.
Adversity is a natural element in which a movie is getting created. In a way, filmmaking is not welcome to the regular world, and you have to anticipate that there will be controversies, there will be adversities.
Almost every single film, you think you're going this way, you hit a wall, you have to go this way, and lo and behold, it takes you into an area that is unexpected and actually is your movie. With a place called Chiapas, I ran into a real wall with Subcomandante Marcos, who was one of the major figures, the iconic figure of the Zapatista uprising, and the two of us ended up arguing. We didn't get along, which was like a nightmare. And and besides all of that, he was busy. He was running a revolution, right? It cranked up the stakes of the film on all sides. It made it a more sophisticated film, a more complex film.
Yo tengo un hermano muerto. ¿Hay alguien que no tenga un hermano muerto? Yo tengo un hermano muerto.
All sorts of sides. There are forces intruding on you, and you have to keep them at distance, and you have to move on anyway.
You have to be able to be alive to the moment. You have to be so aware of everything that is happening around you. When I get something that reads on screen the way it was unfolding in reality, it's still magic to me.
You're always going to miss something, but it's okay. What you need to get, you'll get.
Dureza de vida, nada mais difícil que filmar num lixão. Lixão no Brasil há centenas, onde as pessoas vão pegar o lixo para reciclar, para vender e para pegar comida e comer do lixo mesmo. E esse é o duro para eles. E todo mundo vai lá, fica 20 minutos e faz o Jornal Nacional, para depois são abutres, olha, ecologia, como é que eles vivem assim. E não muda nada, né? O lixão não acaba por causa disso. Como eu fiquei lá uns 10 dias, no primeiro dia tem uma reação hostil e tal. Depois de 5 dias, olha como vai, tudo bem, e tudo ficou razoavelmente fácil. Eu fiz umas 20 xerocos de faces e fui lá mostrando para eles quem é isso aí. E eles diziam, a gente conhecia todos, entende?
Cara, vê minha foto.
Barbudo, Noel.
Papai Noel, né?
Então, a fotografia, mesmo ruim, foi uma forma de aproximá-los, de me indicar pessoas.
Foto minha?
É.
Mas saiu?
Não, isso não é boa imagem. Durante uma hora e depois eu fui à casa dele para falar mais. Quer dizer, são coisas totalmente imprevisíveis, entende?
Que religião o senhor é?
Eu sou naturalista.
Ah, é? O que quer dizer?
Natureza. Eu acredito muito na natureza.
Em Deus, não?
A mesma coisa. Dá na mesma sorte.
I think the access you go in with is often not the same access you come out with. In a way, just by your presence, your friendships, your behaviour, you hope that the trust and the access deepens. You have superficial access, but it's your job to then make it deeper and deeper and deeper to people and what they're feeling, but also often higher and higher and higher in the hierarchy because people in power are always so reluctant to be filmed.
even once Kofi Annan said yes, all the worker bees didn't want to know anything about me. But there was one person who was key to me, and she was a woman who was going to lead a peacekeeping operation over to the Congo. And even she said to me, she said, I know why you're here, and I don't want to have anything to do with you. I don't want to be filmed. I don't think what we do is public. It doesn't help me that you're here, and I'm going to make it as hard as I can to make it impossible for you to film. And I said, okay. Her name was Meg Carey. And I said, okay, Meg, well, there we go. I mean, I'm not going to leave. And we headed off to the Congo the next week, and it took about a year for Meg to come on side, but eventually she did, and eventually Meg became the film, and she became my conduit inside this extremely complex organization.
Pressure. It is once again a unilateral action taken by the government.
Il faut savoir quand tourner. Il faut comprendre le langage des gens, il faut comprendre comment ils se parlent, puis quel est le langage crypté dans chaque personne. Parce qu'il y a des choses qu'on peut ne pas comprendre, mais qui sont importantes à filmer.
I actually do not like meeting people before if I'm going to film with them. I do not even go through any organizations or any contacts at ground level. I just go to the area. 90% of the people I've interviewed in the film are people I've never met in my life before.
फिर मैंने ये छोकरा जला था, इसको मैंने बुझा के इसको दीवार के पीछे फेंक दिया. वहाँ पे एक दीवार की कोड थी, उसके पीछे इसको फेंक दिया.
I decided not to use microphones and lights and any kind of intrusive equipment. I shoot with a tiny handycam, aimed at sort of making the person who I'm with completely comfortable.
मेरे आगे पीछे रहते थे बच्चे, कभी अकेलापन नहीं. याद आती तो कभी रातों को नींद नहीं आती, नींद नहीं आती.
Des fois, c'est très simple. Hein. Vous êtes en face de quelqu'un, vous avez votre caméra, il y a un regard qui s'échange et vous savez que l'autre comprend ce que vous êtes en train de faire, même si c'est pas exactement le contexte, mais il comprend quelque chose, il y a quelque chose qui passe et vous savez que vous allez filmer, quoi, et qu'il se passera quelque chose.
Vous voulez rentrer peut-être? Bon, je ne veux pas vous déranger. Hein? Je ne veux pas vous déranger. Ça me dérange pas, quoi.
Quand je filme, la caméra est là où ça se passe. C'est pour ça que je la tiens à la main. Parce que si je la tiens sur un pied, évidemment l'image sera beaucoup plus léchée, plus précise, elle sera stable, ce qui n'est pas forcément le cas quand je la tiens à l'épaule, puisque je parle aussi en plus, mais c'est surtout que ça peut être long, hein, donc ma pauvre épaule se fatigue. Mais il y a cette tension qui est là, et qui tient l'autre aussi dans un état de tension, et qui fait qu'il y a de l'urgence, il y a de la nécessité à dire les choses.
I'm following something. I'm like on a river. I'm following it. I don't know where it's going. And that's the scary side of it, because I think, maybe I won't get a story, maybe things won't happen. But the sort of wonderful side of it is that you could be somewhere and it all starts happening and you're filming it.
Do you want to go off to bed, darling?
In Hold Me Tight, Let Me Go, there's a scene where there's this little boy, Ben, and you can see that he's very, very quiet because he's in love with his mum and he doesn't want to move. And you can see that she's already disengaged, she's already going on and wanting to leave and go back to her own life. And you can see that the social worker's rather cross with her because she's late and because she knows she doesn't really want to be there and she's already moved on. So you can see these three things. I'm hoping the audience in that one scene will see it from all different points of view. And I think the only way that that can happen is if the scene isn't controlled.
Good boy, Ben. I'll see you again soon. Keep up the good work, Ben.
There's a kind of looseness to it so you can put yourself into it. So they're long shots that hopefully the audience can put themselves into.
you're constantly having to be aware that you shouldn't interfere with the action, so your body cannot get in the way of the door or the relationship with someone else in the room, or you have to be careful that your presence isn't going to block somewhere they might go. And I like the lack of communication. I like the fact that that's just me working that out. So I know what I want from that person, and I know how maybe I'm going to sit with them and how I'm going to shoot with them. The nightmare is obviously being a cameraman is a whole job in itself, and quite a complicated job, and there's a lot that can go wrong.
The feeling of holding a camera and being part of a scene and reacting and responding to a scene, it's just thrilling. And that is the secret that camera people never tell, that the joy is in the shooting.
I don't think the way most cinematographers do, getting a wide shot and a close-up and a reaction shot and so forth. I see things the way I would as a person. And I think that helps the process for the person who watches it to feel a greater closeness to what's going on. The opening scene of Salesman is such a perfect kind of forecast of what's to come.
Which plan would be the best for you, the A, B, or C? You wouldn't want to...
Also such a perfect revelation of my camera work at its best. In the middle of that little scene, you see the child on the mother's lap yawning. And then it seems that it's exactly the right moment, but a moment totally chosen by the child, not by me. She goes over to the piano and knocks out a tune that Beethoven couldn't have created more appropriately for the mood.
I just couldn't afford it now. We would swamp with medical bills.
In the kind of shooting that I do, the smaller the team, the better able you'll be to, not interfere with the process that you're trying to shoot. So I think, it's best if the person who is the director is either doing sound or shooting and not just standing around and conducting, which, I just would want that person to be out of the room.
No hay cosa más agradable cuando tú sientes que la sensibilidad de tu cámara es la misma que la tuya y el sonidista. Cuando los tres están unidos por un cable invisible, es fantástico, porque es la única manera de... Es como el jazz. Miller era un hombre extraordinario, de una sensibilidad, de un talento fuera de lo común. Mucho durante el rodaje y antes del rodaje, mucho. Intercambiamos películas, ideas, él me contaba cosas que él le gustaría hacer y yo le contaba las mías y coincidíamos en casi siempre.
I think when you work with a camera person, the difficulty I'm sure for every director is that the camera person has to be your eyes, and you have to have a certain trust in them. I work with Claire Pyman, who's a Dutch camera woman, and we've worked together now for about 14 years. While I create and imagine a lot of scenes, finally it's up to Claire to see it the way I see it. In Don't Ask Why, I wanted a very particular way of filming the scene when Anusha is walking through the bazaar and there are all these men, staring at her. I'd explained it to Claire. She shot it for me. She showed it to me. And she said, "Is this what you want?" And I said, "No." I told her that I really wanted it to be more threatening, more like people are really looking at her and watching her, and I wanted to get a lot of faces in and so on. And then she was able to create that for me.
The camera person is confined to what they see and hear. I'm looking at the broader horizon. I'm seeing what's happening outside the frame, and I'm directing them to the things that I want to see. And with a really good camera person, and I've had very good relationships with very, very good people, it becomes a tango, becomes a dance. You know, you're whispering in their ear that really, if they'll just go a little longer and pan a little to the right, you know, that's really where I want to be, and they'll find two faces there, and you know, so it's a process of literally directing the shot, and so that's a very important component for me as well, the visual sense.
For Bones of the Forest, Heather and I were trying to give you an experiential sense of the beauty and grandeur and subtlety of the old-growth forest, so that you could actually feel for yourself and how important they were to save. And in order to express that fully, it seemed that we needed to go outside the usual palette of just solid standard nature shots. You know, we wanted to actually show you also the time of the forest, you know, which has its own pace. So time-lapse photography was part of that. It's not eye candy. It's not just special effects. It's really about trying to break through pattern thinking and allow us a fresh perspective on something.
I do think that not nearly enough emphasis is put on the visual side of filmmaking, of documentary filmmaking, because the story is so important, and the people who tend to make documentaries are I mean, they're the high priests of that issue, and they're just so swept up by the rightness of the issue that they forget that they got to tell a story. And they got to tell a story to people who don't care nearly as much about this subject as they do.
On the one hand, many of my colleagues were working to give the information necessary for troop contributors.
I was really, really careful about where I filmed those people and when I filmed them. And I had spent so much time at the UN building in New York that I knew at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a certain kind of weather day, if I put Meg in this room there, the light would be good on her. And I would only film her at that time, because I knew she was going to give me the same kind of material, whether we filmed her at 8 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock at night in this better light. So why not make the effort to film it when the light was just right?
Because you felt, what am I doing wrong that I'm not being able to convince these member states that they need to provide the troops necessary to save these lives?
You're presenting a palette of colors for the editor so that he or she can really edit with pacing and with the abstract rather than the literal. And then you're really storytelling. There's one shot in a place called Chiapas, and it's done by a wonderful Mexican cinematographer by the name of Eduardo Herrera.
Marco says the Zapatista movement is, in fact, more about ideas than bullets.
The entire press corps is parked on the edge of the riverbank. And where does Eduardo put himself and his camera? Right in the middle of the river. He swings to reveal 50 photographers. And so there's a huge payoff. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a sense of humor to the shot. There's a place for great art in all of this.
I read this book. It's about two men on a mountain. And I said, this is such a wonderful subject for a documentary, but how the hell do you do it? You couldn't make that story as a fiction film either. And people have been trying for many years, and Tom Cruise, for instance, had the rights, and lots of different people had the rights, and nobody had managed to make a fiction film out of it because, again, it's all internal. And documentary is wonderfully internal because, you know, people love to talk in a documentary. So I thought, well, the only way to do this is to combine some elements of drama with elements of documentary. But I was so nervous about doing that. That was the real challenge. How do you get reconstruction that really matches up to reality, especially matches up to this extraordinary story?
came flooding down my thigh, and my knee was very, very, very painful.
The reenactment is not reenacting anything. It's there to make you think about reality, about what we take to be reality, what we think is reality, what claims to be reality.
Because the whole time we're screwing around and not doing a damn job, Americans are dying.
Standard operating procedure is a movie with 3 ingredients. One of them is interviews with real people. The second ingredient is the photographs. The photographs that were taken at Abu Ghraib in the fall of 2003. And the third element is reenacted material, bits and pieces, detail. I like going after odd details.
On his fingers. And he was told he would be electrocuted if he fell off.
And those are constructed. But underneath all of it is this pursuit of some truth.
When you open your newspaper or you hear a news report, you just get the facts. And the way in which things actually happen is very complicated and circumstantial and comes out of so many different influences. I think in a film like Battle for Haditha, you try and recreate all that. So you create many layers, hopefully, of understanding that you don't get from the news reports in other media.
In the wrong hands, that's quite dangerous, which is when you recreate. With real people who come with all that sort of extraordinary behaviour when people have been in a situation. They know how to behave. And, I mean, I think Battle for Haditha is absolutely brilliant. And I think, thank God it's Nick doing it, because as a technique, it's quite dangerous to recreate reality because it's so seductive. You really, truly believe that is what happened. If reality programmes are borrowing the sexy packaging of fiction, and fiction is borrowing the immediacy and excitement of documentary, and news, as we know, I don't know where that's going, then it's so confusing for people to know what is or isn't truthful in the end, and what is whose view, and what actually happened or didn't. And I just think it's something we should be careful of, and just sort of speak more about the fact that there is this real crossover.
C'est une page d'Edgar Morin, le co-réalisateur de Chronique d'un été. Il dit « Nous devons le savoir, le cinéma de fiction est dans son principe beaucoup moins illusoire et beaucoup moins menteur que le cinéma dit documentaire. Parce que l'auteur et le spectateur savent qu'il est fiction. C'est-à-dire qu'il porte sa vérité dans son imaginaire. Par contre, le cinéma documentaire camoufle sa fiction et son imaginaire derrière l'image reflet du réel.
For me, the distinction between feature films, I mean narrative feature films, and documentaries doesn't exist that much. For me, it's all movies. And the borderline is quite often blurred. In documentaries, I keep inventing, I keep using my fantasy, I invent dreams.
Le cinéma documentaire est aussi du cinéma et qu'à ce titre, la dimension sonore est un véritable langage qu'il faut développer et chaque film doit trouver son propre langage. On a essayé de faire en sorte que le fleuve existe au niveau du son.
I think the sound is like the heartbeat of a film. If the sound isn't good, then the film's thin, and you know the sound is where you get the emotion of a film. I mean, with Hold Me Tight, Let Me Go, the classrooms are so noisy, and you look at it and you don't maybe appreciate what Mary's done.
Are you disappointed? Well done.
Because her sound's so good, people just accept it.
Don't hurt other people because you're crossing.
You can hear everything everybody's saying. They're all on different sides of the room, and there's always kids screaming in the room at the same time, but you can hear everything really truly. And the film would be unwatchable if it hadn't been for Mary.
That's okay to feel like that, but you need to let us help you. That's why we're here. You don't need to do that, because I'd rather look.
And also, they have to be so strong. I mean, she's kind of, you know, like a ballet dancer, getting close to everybody, following everything, watching me, we're working together. It's a whole skill, you know, which
Alex.
People don't often notice.
Alex, in a mainstream school, you can't be under the table all the time, can you?
I wouldn't do that. I never used to do that in the last 2 schools I went to.
One of the things that's really an error in the way things are going these days is that people actually think that a sound recordist is disposable and that you can do it yourself, or you're a poor camera person who is supposed to be framing and making sure that the world is in focus and lit properly is supposed to take this on, or God forbid the director do it.
This is an unlawful assembly. All persons on the Saratoga Pocket Chestnut, whether you're on the street, the sidewalks, or in the doorways, you must disperse at this time or you will be arrested.
When we start off with an awareness of sound as an important aspect of the overall film and leave space for it and anticipate it and work it in while we're picture editing, the marriage of the two can become quite profound and can move us to much deeper places. It can tell another level of the story, and sound takes us to deep places in a way that scent does, for example. Sound triggers emotions, sound triggers memory. So we can really hit people at a deep level with sound.
One of my favorite pieces of sound in Touching the Void is the sound of the crevasses. It should be something that's scary, but something that also has a human tone to it. We played around with all these different sounds, and eventually one day the sound engineer came to me and said, you know, I've got this great sound for you. Listen to this. This is this underlying sound for the crevasses. And he played it to me, and I thought, wow, that's very spooky. And I said, what is it? And he said, that's the sound of a leopard roaring, slowed down 50 times. So it was this wonderful animal sound, but it felt so deep and profound and kind of frightening, but mournful at the same time.
I knew before we went to China that I wanted the design to emerge out of the industrial soundscape that we were going to be immersed in. So we gathered an enormous amount of wild sound. And I wanted the density of that industrial soundscape to be apparent in the film, but also that sometimes melody or rhythm would emerge from that soundscape, and you couldn't tell, am I hearing, is this music or is it just, you know, the rhythm of some hammer or machine? And then it would go back down into that soundscape and come out and go down without ever, only a few times emerging as a clear, distinct element before subsuming itself back down into the sound.
J'ai fait beaucoup de films où il n'y a pas du tout de musique. Et là où il y en a très très peu. Parce que je pense que la nature de l'image documentaire fait que c'est une image qui supporte mal la musique. C'est-à-dire que la musique, dans l'espace du documentaire, a tendance à écraser l'image.
C'est une interprétation, la musique. C'est le cinéaste qui dit, ben, écoutez, moi, je vous fais entendre une musique là, sur ces images-là pour que vous ayez une impression. C'est de l'impressionnisme. Je pense pas que le documentaire soit de l'impressionnisme. C'est du réalisme. Et du réalisme, la musique Elle n'a rien à faire là.
I really love music, and I think more and more documentaries are starting to think that you don't have to be purist about it, that you can, like all other aspects of cinema, that audiences really need an oral scape as well as a kind of visual scape.
I don't like music that is supposed to tell you what to think. But I do like music that creates a bed where things are driven forward. The soundtrack to The Thin Blue Line is, I think, one of the best things that Philip has ever done. It is essential to the movie.
Why did I meet this kid? I don't know.
If this is a nonfiction film noir, that idea of inexorability, the idea of being trapped in a web of fate, those ideas are really driven home by the soundtrack, by the Philip Glass score.
Creo que no hay que enfatizar una situación dramática poniéndole encima música dramática. Hay que tener mucho cuidado, mucha prudencia y para la dosificación de esa música, dónde va a ser colocada. Me gustaba la música de Ignacio porque es una música, porque sus manos tiemblan y por lo tanto toca mal. Es decir, él simboliza en cierto modo la memoria, el pasado.
Music is an integral element of storytelling, of changing and guiding our perspectives, our emotional perspectives, but not only emotional. It gives new perspectives, new insights, a different kind of vision.
Pour ce film, je ne voulais pas de musique de film, et dès le départ, je me suis dit, ce doit être la voix d'une chanteuse. Mais je ne veux pas non plus qu'il y ait des chants. Je ne veux pas qu'on entende des paroles articulées. Et c'est donc quelque chose qui doit sortir des tripes de la chanteuse. Voilà. Je lui ai dit, je veux que tu sois un peu, tu es un peu mère, la mère. Tu es la mère, tu es la mère, tu es l'Algérie. Et tu avais des enfants autour de toi, ils se sont entretués, et tu réagis à ça. Des fois, tu as de la colère, des fois, tu as de la tristesse, des fois, tu voudrais, par ton simple chant, refaire les choses autrement, qu'elles ne se sont faites. Voilà. Tu es un personnage.
The music creates unifying shape. But a part of sound, of course, is narration. And I think it's a phenomenally powerful element. It's the voice of a storyteller. And what could be wrong with being told a story?
Narration in documentary films sometimes is a very beautiful element, and most times it's a prosthesis. It's like crutches, you know. It's like to help, you know, tell a story without having the images, you know, because you don't have the images, so you have to tell what's happening, you know, instead of showing. And showing is always better than telling, you know.
I do get annoyed when I hear people say, oh, we don't want narration, you know, like, or they hire you as a narration writer. And they say, well, we didn't really want narration, but we want to bring you in because we got some problems in the storytelling, you know. Says, well, then don't use narration. If you don't like it, don't use it. But if you use it, love it. And it can be beautiful. It can be the invocation to a dream. I think of narration as being a voice in your ear who's telling you a story.
Like so many other boys,
dreaming of being an RAF pilot. And which is a very different way to think of it than a booming voice of God or from a public podium.
About what's right and wrong in war.
I will write things and then we'll start to assemble scenes, write to the scenes, and then we'll go the other way around. We'll use the writing as a guide to the scenes. It's a dance back and forth.
I think editing is a really underrated skill.
It's like a puzzle.
This is important, that's important, that's important, and throw away the rest.
Creating a story where there really is no story.
I've never ever trusted the process. I sit in the edit absolutely all the time.
But then you say, well, what does that cutaway do?
As a kind of mind game.
And that's one definition of a lie.
Endings are tricky, and the shaping and the sculpting.
Weaving together.
Couper, vous arranger. And it's sometimes extremely painful.
And you have to massage the material over and over, over and over, over and over again until it looks so simple that everybody will say, well, what took you so long?
And it's the despair, I guess, I think you go through almost every time you make a documentary. You come back and you see your rushes and they seem such poor, pathetic things. And you think, this isn't the film I wanted to make. And then you have to figure out, well, what is the film that's in there? What's speaking to you about these rushes here?
The biggest problem you find in the cutting room is that usually the creator, the director, is not willing to accept that shadow, that gap between their intentions and what the material gives them.
Your allegiance eventually transfers from your memory of the event to what you have captured on film. And once that transfer takes place, that's when editing really starts to happen, when you know, okay, this is the finite universe I have to deal with.
Pero es el hermoso proceso con otra persona, estar solamente con una otra persona que es tu persona de confianza. Armar todo eso y saber que todo lo que has filmado toma una vida diferente, creo que eso es lo que más me gusta. Sí, el montaje.
There's times when you're working on something and you think, gosh, it would have been amazing if I had known that first. And that's what I try to do in the film, is to try to create the ideal journey and replicate those moments that were really memorable along the way of making the film.
You look at the elements that you've got and you figure out, how to form a braid out of those elements that will allow each strand to inform the other and to keep re-engaging the audience's interest in the moment.
When we first met, the age difference was a big problem for me.
You're interweaving material to create a more complicated and yet enlightening result.
And Philip came into my life, and he had lost.
I don't think my films are made in the cutting room. I think the cutting room is more a place where you simplify material and you find themes and arguments that run through the material and clear, in a sense, the brush from it so that they become more obvious.
With The Peacekeepers, there were so many different ways to go with that film in the editing room that for the first couple of months we struggled because we were putting way too much into it. I mean, I had a whole history of the Congo and Mobutu and how it got to this point that there was a civil war and all of that stuff. And in the end, nobody cared. They didn't care. They just cared about Meg.
You may not want to deal with them, and they may have committed all sorts of human rights abuses, but unfortunately you have to deal with them because they're the ones with the power. What do these military leaders want?
People need a human being that can lead them through a kind of political, psychological, logistical minefield. And once Meg came on screen, the film came alive. And all of this other stuff that we had thrown in there about the history of the Congo and how it got to this point, people didn't care about. We couldn't make them care about it.
You have to be able to dump very good footage and not fit it in the film somehow. Just dump it because it doesn't fit into that movie. That's it.
Vous faites un montage, vous racontez une histoire, vous mettez les scènes les unes après les autres, vous coupez, vous arrangez, et oui, vous manipulez. Forcément, vous racontez votre histoire, votre vision de l'histoire.
This case is no more and no longer about Kathleen. The DA has to win. That's it.
Vous ne savez même pas si Kathleen Peterson a été tuée ou c'est un accident. Et les faits dans cette histoire peuvent être lus comme ça, dans les deux sens, la plupart du temps. C'est vous face à la réalité. Est-ce que vous avez été honnête envers la vérité intérieure des personnages, la vérité de l'histoire? C'est surtout ça qu'il faut atteindre.
The film is going to reveal itself out of the unexpected moments, not out of what you planned, not when you were working with pencil and paper. It's going to come out of things that took you by surprise, and that you maybe even forgot in the whole welter of shooting.
You put two things together on the editing table and you're like, how is this possible? And then it's on in front of 1,000 people and they all go, wow, you know.
I sometimes think of a movie as a sausage casing, and you're trying to ram as much meat into that sausage as you possibly can, but there are limits. And then you have to stop. There's a dream of actually influencing the world in some way. Righting some wrong, correcting some evil. It's the documentarian as possible superhero. You know, the guy who fixes the bad stuff.
The films that we make are our teachers. I mean, they're our teachers, and then we sort of surrender to them.
C'est d'arriver à chercher tout le temps un petit peu plus de beauté, puis d'essayer d'avoir quelque chose de parfait, mais tu l'as jamais. Tu sais, c'est ça. Tu sais, on l'essaye, hein? On essaye tout le temps.
You know, I often say to people that the answer to life is becoming a documentary filmmaker. If you want to solve all your life's problems, become a documentary filmmaker because it offers you everything.
If you look at just the number of titles that have been playing theatrically that people are really talking about, the stylistic breadth of those films is really widened. There's a lot more inventiveness in terms of what's accepted.
New types of distribution systems have been developed with the advent of the internet. Everybody now literally is a documentary filmmaker, or anybody with a cell phone.
I can't imagine anything more important than portraying in a very truthful, authentic fashion what's really going on in the world.
C'est comment vous vous débrouillez avec la vie. Et je crois que d'un film à un autre, je ne pose pas d'autres questions.
Digamos que después de hacer una película uno queda enriquecido con los personajes y que nunca más abandonan tu vida, nunca. Son tantas las veces que en la mesa de montaje uno los ve que ellos se olvidan de uno, pero uno nunca de ellos. Te acuerdas del tono de voz, de cómo respiran.
I've been able to be in so many situations that are not part of my life. Not only be there, but to have to make some sense of it for somebody else who's not going to be there. That I really love. That's still as much fun to me as it was day one.